Welcome to Addicted to Murder. This is Courtney, licensed professional counselor with over a decade of experience.
And this is Trisha, and I just got back from lunch with my sister where I agroted.
Agroted?
Yeah, I overindulged.
Oh.
I ate too much. I was eating very quickly because I knew I was late for our pod sesh. But I was hungry, and I was like, I can get all this in before it's time to record, and I was wrong.
Oh. What did you have for lunch?
I had a homemade, chicken pot pie pocket, hot pocket type of situation at this bakery in town, and then a salad.
That sounds good.
It was good, but I ate it really quick, and then my sister got a ham and cheese stuffed pretzel.
Ooh.
Which was also, I like the bread part, but the ham's just too salty for me, but it was good too.
Got it.
And that's what a groat means, to overindulge.
I will hold on to that word.
Because we all do it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sometimes, indeed. So we are back with a new case, and it was a case that I picked. And before we get into that, though, I will have a question for Courtney. And just a little background for those of you who don't live in the Pacific Northwest. We had an awful ice storm that hit us the week before last. Well, the ice storm hit at a certain time, but the effects have lasted for a long time. I was without power on and off for 5 days, no internet. But I had hot water and I have camping stuff, so I was okay. Courtney was out of power for how long?
For 9 days.
And no internet. And
no heat. And we had a boil water advisory for a while there.
So it was boil the water, but how do you boil the water if you have no electricity?
Exactly.
So it's been a thing. And so anyways, I'm just prefacing that because, Courtney, I wanted to ask you for the question, what was something that you learned about yourself during that time of living like that?
I would say I learned that out of the other creatures that live in my house, so partner and animals, I am somehow the calmest one. Yeah. So even when everyone else around me was sort of anxious and pacing and panicking and being weird, I was just kind of well, we have no power. Gotta live with that.
It doesn't really surprise me because you're very calm by nature. But I guess what does surprise me a little bit is your partner typically an anxious person?
Yes.
But
he hides it well a lot of the time.
Well, because we've talked about this before, where sometimes when people are anxious all the time, like myself, when the shit hits the fan, they actually are the most calm in the situation. But that's not what you saw in this one.
Yeah. Well, I think compounding on it, I also think my partner probably has ADHD.
Oh.
He thinks so too. But so he is typically doing 27 things at once, and he couldn't do any of the things that he normally does.
That was a thing, was the boredom of I mean, you could read.
Which is pretty much what I did. I was just during daylight hours, I'm going to read. And then when it's dark, I'm going to sleep. But yeah, he could not focus on just one thing.
Oh, you couldn't even go outside.
Yeah, we couldn't leave our house.
You would slip and fall. I fell twice.
Yeah. So.
A gal I work with she was also working in the ER, and she said it was just awful. People were not being able to be seen, and because no one had power, they couldn't really make them go home. So it was just tons and tons of people in there, and it was just really, really bad.
I believe that.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think what I realized was that all of my camping experience, I was fine. I made coffee in the morning with my percolator on my little Coleman stove. I made steaks on the barbecue because I had the propane. I had emergency. I make candles, so I had tons of candles. I had a indoor propane heater from the last time our power went out. I had a little portable power station. I didn't have a generator, but I mean, this has happened before, so I was sort of prepared. And then, like I said, with all of my camping equipment, we had people over who had less than us because our power would come on for a minute, and then as soon as the power came on, I was doing a little laundry or washing dishes or using the dishwasher or whatever, vacuuming, because not only did we have some people stay with us, we had their animals. So we at one point had 5 dogs, 2 cats, 5 adults, and a child in my house.
That is a lot of people in your house, which is not that big.
No, not for that many people. But, we had more than they had. So
Yeah.
what do? You don't turn people away.
Exactly. Yeah, I was lucky enough to have, some friends that were able to put us up once we were able to leave our driveway.
Right. Like getting to my parents' house where they had all the things I couldn't do.
Exactly.
It's too icy. Couldn't even drive. But anyhow.
But we all made it through safe.
We did.
There is no permanent damage to...
I lost a fence, but it's been rebuilt.
Yeah. We lost a lot of limbs from a lot of trees, but fortunately no major damage to anything like on our home or cars or anything. So as unlucky as we were also very lucky.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to see you. I know we didn't do this last week because of the issues.
Right, exactly.
So, all right, everybody. That's that. That's where we've been. I hope everyone else is safe. I know that not everyone else was as lucky as us. And if you're one of our listeners, I hope that your sense of normalcy is coming back.
Yes.
And that you didn't have anything awful happen.
I agree.
And I'm sorry if you did, because that fucking sucks. But we are going to talk about a new killer today. Killer I use loosely because they never officially charged him with any murders.
Right.
But piece of shit, yes, he wins that title. David Parker Ray, a.k.a. the Toy Box Killer.
Oof.
He is... you guys will hear, he's awful. If you haven't heard of him, ugh. The book that we used for this case was called Slow Death, the sickest serial torture slayer ever to stalk the Southwest by Jim Fielder.
That seems like a good description of him, actually.
Yeah. Yes, for sure. And this guy, he has a ton of stuff on him on YouTube and other true crime shows because he's a little bit unique in what he did. He also had a partner.
Right.
More than one, which we don't see too often. So there's a lot to go over.
Yeah, there was a really good episode of I Survived.
Oh, yeah? Which one do they interview? The one that gets away first?
No, the one that got away last.
Or sorry, that's what I meant. The one that turns him in, basically.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if I've seen that one or not.
I feel like we watched it together.
Maybe. Okay.
Maybe it was I Survived a Serial Killer, not just I Survived.
Oh, okay. Well,
But still.
I probably did. You know me and my memory. It's awesome. But we're going to start. And here we go. Today we're going over one of the most notoriously evil men in American history. He was an extreme sadist with an intense, insatiable appetite for torture and deviant sexual gratification at the cost of possibly countless lives. Now, remember we said that he didn't officially get charged, but there was suspicion that he was involved with a whole lot. Mulder? Sorry, my dog was barking. So what's frustrating about this case is that, he died before he disclosed any of the actual murders he is thought to have committed. Today we are here to discuss David Parker Ray, a.k.a. the Toy Box Killer, and his accomplice, Cindy Hendy. His daughter was also thought to have been an accomplice, and we'll talk about her as well. So David Parker Ray was born November 6th, 1939 in Belen, New Mexico to Cecil and Nettie Ray. Prior to David's birth, his uncle David had been accidentally shot and killed by his brother Alden when he was 13, playing cowboys and Indians. David was born the following year, and his grandmother was sure that he was the reincarnation of her departed son. She insisted he be named David after him, and she wanted to raise him. David's biological parents were poor, and they agreed to him and his siblings being raised by their very strict grandparents. David had this to say about his childhood. Quote, "There really wasn't much affection in my childhood. I was there physically, but nobody paid any attention to me. You know, it was like I wasn't really there at all." Courtney, you know what I'm going to ask you? Lay it out for us. Bio parents giving custody to grandparents, and then grandparents seemingly neglectful of David, who was told that he was the reincarnation of his dead uncle.
So there seems to be kind of a two-layered case of rejection and abandonment going on here. On the one hand, there is the fact that David's parents left him with his grandparents and didn't really seem to put effort into maintaining any sort of relationship with him. And so many children experience feelings of abandonment in this type of situation. Then there's this extra impact of his grandmother believing he was the incarnation of his uncle. You know, David wasn't valued or loved for being himself. His value and acceptance was conditional on his kind of taking his uncle's place. And I imagine that as he started to grow up and probably did not look, think, or act just like his uncle, his grandmother may have kind of rejected him again and stopped giving him the attention that he needed.
Well, David felt as if his parents, quote, pawned him off to his grandparents. He said that every 6 months or so, his dad would come around, but he was often drunk. And when he did come by, he would bring little David True Detective magazines. David claimed that when he was about 10 years old, he started to have his violent fantasies, or what he called fantastic dreams, about raping and killing girls. He claimed that in these fantasies, he would always use a broken beer bottle. Courtney, doesn't 10 seem to be a little young to have this kind of fantasy?
I'd say yes, 10 years old is a bit young for such a specific fantasy to be developed in kind of a neurotypical situation. And, you know, children hit puberty and start to think about sex and relationships at different ages, so he could have been a little bit like sexually precocious. But I would also guess that those detective magazines exposed David to sexual and violent materials that were entirely inappropriate for a child his age. And without attentive parents to protect him or explain things to him, he had to build his own understanding of what he saw. So from a more psychodynamic perspective, you know, thinking Freud and that kind of thing, it could be suggested that the broken beer bottle from his fantasies was a symbolic representation of his anger about his father's drinking.
Well, David claimed he hated his grandmother. He felt she didn't care about any of them at all. By the time he was 12 years old, he was making his own bombs and setting off explosives in the woods. He claimed that his grandmother had no clue what was going on. His father also would bring him pornographic and violent magazines. Per Wikipedia, and David claims that by the time he was 15, he had, quote, a private dungeon under a big pinyon pine tree. I had a hangman's noose and a collection of broken beer bottles I planned to use on girls someday. When I got lonesome, I used to fuck a hole I dug in the ground. David claims that he was, as a child and even later as an adult, extremely shy. He wouldn't even look at girls. He would keep his eyes down. He didn't even date until he was 18 years old. He claims that he got married when he was 19, and at that time he was a virgin. Courtney, I know he's not giving us a ton, but why do you think he wanted to hurt women so badly from so young that he made a dungeon and saved beer bottles for raping them? And also, this theme of these people we study, of them being terrified of women, seems to be pretty common. It's like they go from 0 to 60. They're too shy to even look at a girl, but then they go right on to torture and killing them.
Well, it's, you know, pretty clear that David was demonstrating antisocial behaviors from a pretty young age and without any sort of parental intervention at all. There were no limits in place to prevent him from taking action about his fantasies. And also, you know, there are our good friends that come up a lot, power and control. David was holding anger towards probably his mom and grandmother for not caring about him. And he was likely holding anger towards girls his own age for not noticing him and causing him to feel shame about his shyness. He couldn't make the girls and women do what he wanted in regular life, but he could overpower and control them in his fantasies and theoretically in the dungeon that he had built.
Well, in 1959, David was married, and the following year he joined the Army and went to Korea. His wife got pregnant in 1960, and they had a boy. He got divorced a year later. David claims his wife would leave their infant son alone so she could go out and party. By the time he got back from Korea, his son had been placed in DHS custody, and he was granted custody after that. His biological mother and his stepfather raised his son until he finished his tour of duty. A couple years later, David remarried, and 90 days after that, he got divorced. In 1966, he got married for a third time, and he and Glenda were married for nearly 15 years. He had a daughter with Glenda in 1967. David was attending aircraft mechanic school in Tulsa by this time. Quote, "One day, out of the clear blue sky, my wife decided she was going to bring home the bacon for us by becoming a whore. I didn't like it at all, but it sure paid the bills." Courtney?
I think that David's multiple marriages speak to the difficulty he had with forming strong, secure attachments with others. He may have gotten married initially even because that's just what people are supposed to do, and it would have guaranteed him access to sex, which he wasn't getting before. But then, when his wives started doing things that he didn't like, but he couldn't stop them from doing, it was a challenge to his need for control over them, and so he would want to end the relationships. I imagine it may have been highly emasculating to David when Glenda started doing sex work to make money, because he, as the man, was, supposed to provide, and he shouldn't have had to share his wife with other men.
David claims he still had his fantasies, and sometimes his wife would let him tie her up. He had a dungeon in the bottom level of their house, but she never went in there. By the 1970s, David was, quote, designing custom-made torture equipment and selling the stuff in Screw magazine. David left Glenda in 1981 when he found her in bed with the man on her day off. He knew it had nothing to do with money, and so he left her and joined up with her sister-in-law. So he got with Glenda's sister. The two of them went to California next and grew marijuana in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They did that for about a year, then left, deciding they wanted to get normal jobs. They flipped a coin on where to go and ended up in Phoenix. There, David got a job as a mechanic, and he and his ex-wife's sister-in-law got married in 83. Sorry. He ended up marrying the sister-in-law. David claims at this time he still had the, quote, fantasy, and at about every 6-month intervals. Quote, "I can't tell you what it felt like working around all that temptation. Any time of day you could see them, hookers, 4 or 5 of them walking by, night and day. I started hiring girls to help relieve the pressure of my fantasy. I'd whip them, but I'd never break the skin, never. His current bride, Joni, would not entertain his fantasies, and she would get jealous of what he was doing. David said she started to lose it mentally and would drink heavily and would have many seizures due to the epilepsy she had. One time she even threatened him by putting a pistol to his head. In 1994, David made her leave and go to her mother's house in Pennsylvania. And then David was alone for the next 3 years. Courtney?
I would say that David was now able to start acting out his fantasies, right? First with kind of minor bondage with his ex-wife, and then increasing the violence with sex workers. And like we've discussed before with other killers, there is often a slow escalation of violence as a serial killer moves closer to their first kill.
David claimed that his fantasies were getting more and more persistent, and he started to take Viagra, which did not help the situation. David was drawing out his fantasies, and he was reading many true crime books, predominantly about serial killers, but he also liked the horror genre as well. Yes, David claims he was really lonely, and that is until he met Cindy Hendy. So we're going to talk about her. Switch gears a little bit. Cynthia Hendy was born on February 6, 1960, near Everett, Washington. She was from a very poor family. Her mom worked as a bartender and did not give any money to her children. An acquaintance of Cindy was interviewed and relayed the following information. They were hungry kids. They were, quote, lucky to get a can of tuna fish out of Cindy's mom. We'd go over after school, and Cindy would have to beg like hell till her mother threw out a can of tuna fish just to get rid of us. Cindy's mom dated a man named Dick, and when Cindy was very young, Dick would beat Cindy's mom in front of Cindy and her friends. Her mom her mom later married a man that, quote, tried to mess with her in bed. Cindy was only 8 years old at the time. When Cindy built up the courage to tell her mom what was occurring, she was 11 years old, so for 3 years. Her stepfather claimed that he had been drunk and it was an honest mistake getting into the wrong bed and violating Cindy. The child, when he thought it was his wife in bed when it was really the child. Well, Cindy's mom believed Dick, and the two of them kicked Cindy out of the house when she was only 12 years old. Courtney, we have poverty, most like food scarcity. We have domestic violence in front of a child. We have child sex abuse. We have a mother not believing her daughter, an abuse victim. And finally, we have a 12-year-old being forced from her home, her own mother choosing a potential pedophile over her own daughter. Let's go over that.
Well, there is so much to unpack here. Childhood neglect is the most common type of child abuse, but it's also the most commonly ignored or misunderstood. A child who experiences food scarcity and neglect is likely also experiencing high levels of the hormone cortisol, which is released during stress and is related to anxiety. So, not having a parent who even tried to meet Cindy's needs most likely also caused an attachment wound and potentially led to a pattern of disorganized